Good morning. I'm Jonathan Pettis, and I'm the Director of Cybersecurity and Information Technology Solutions at Dynetics. And it is my pleasure this morning to introduce our next speaker for this session. Dr. Ron Ross is a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. His focus areas include information security, system security engineering, and risk management. Dr. Ross leads the Federal Information Security Modernization Act implementation project, which includes the development of security standards and guidelines for the federal government, contractors, and the United States critical infrastructure. I think the majority of this audience is familiar with and has been impacted by his work. His current publications practically read like a list of the greatest hits in cybersecurity standards, and they include Federal Information Processing Standards FIPS 199 for security categorization, FIPS 200 for security requirements, and NIST special publications on enterprise risk management, security and privacy controls, security assessment, risk management framework, risk assessment, system security engineering, and as someone who just retired from the federal government and joined industry, my new personal favorite, 800-171 on security requirements for non-federal systems and organizations. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Ross several years ago when I was at NASA as the Chief Information Officer, and I can tell you that he is not only the brilliant architect of these standards that underpin so much of how we approach cybersecurity in the government sector today, but he's also a pragmatic and helpful consultant in utilizing the standards he has architected. Dr. Ross also leads the Joint Task Force and Interagency Partnership with responsibility for the development of the Unified Information Security Framework for the federal government and its contractors. A graduate of the United States Military Academy, Dr. Ross served in many leadership and technical positions during his 20-year career in the United States Army. He has received a long and impressive list of awards, including the Defense Superior Service Medal, a Presidential Rank Award, and has been inducted into not just one, but two Halls of Fame, the Information Security or System Security Association Hall of Fame and the National Cybersecurity Hall of Fame. Please join me in welcoming one of the most influential leaders, I believe, in the cybersecurity field today, Dr. Ron Ross.
Well, good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing today? Good? Great. This is hallowed ground for me. I love coming to Alabama because I'm a huge NASA fan, and Jonathan, great CIO for NASA for so many years. Thank you for your service. I also love NASCAR, and those of you, Talladega, that is the epicenter of the NASCAR world, so when I come down to Alabama, it's a great day and great trip. This is a very special day, June the 6th. It was 45 years ago that I graduated from the military academy, but more importantly, this is D-Day. And those of you who did not remember that, it's a very special day for anybody who has served in the military, in any branch. And I want to just take this opportunity before we dive into some of the details today to thank all of our folks, active duty military who might be here today, all of those contractors and DOD civilians and all the federal employees, first responders and the FBI. All of these folks have one thing in common. They're serving their country in a cause that's greater than just the dollars that they can earn, and that's a hugely important thing. We talk about this, especially during this time, when our government is going through, there's a lot of turmoil now, and everybody who watches the news understands that, but serving the federal government, federal service is critical, whether it's military or civilian, because the kind of government that we have is made up of citizens. And it's important always to remember that. The most important thing I think about every day when I get up, I just turned 67 years old, and I'm on Medicare and Social Security now, so I probably should be retired, but I still have that military sense of mission. There's a lot left to do. And every morning when I get up and I walk my dog, I walk out that front door and I take a big, deep breath of freedom. And that's the real reason that I think cybersecurity and privacy are so important today. It's about freedom. And a lot of you might not say, well, how does that relate to two-factor authentication or encryption, all those things? They're very much related because today we are incredibly dependent on information technology for everything we do. It's in every one of our critical infrastructure sectors. It's across every federal agency, our Fortune 500 companies, our small mom and pop companies. We all use the same base of technology today, and it's highly vulnerable. That's the reason why cybersecurity and privacy matter so much. We've all been victims of cyber breaches over the years. My worst year was in 2015. That year, as many of you remember, we had the OPM breach. And for those of you who have security clearances, you'll know exactly, you were probably part of that breach. I have a top secret clearance. That was the first thing that I got hit with in 2015. The second thing was the Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield breach. I'm a federal employee, and my healthcare records are sitting in that big database. The only good news I got in 2015, I wasn't part of the Ashley Madison breach, thank goodness. So you might wonder, what do those three attacks have in common? Well, this is the story of cyber today. We are building an incredibly complex world of interconnected, very powerful computers, giving us great capability. But our adversaries know that, they know our vulnerabilities, and they will stop at nothing to get whatever they want to get. Now, in this particular case, OPM, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Ashley Madison, what does that give you? Well, it gives you a target list that you can do a query on. You could say, give me all the federal employees who have a top secret clearance, who have potentially embarrassing healthcare issues, and who are cheating on their spouses. And that's a target list for espionage. And that is what I call an intergenerational breach. We're never getting that SF-86 data back again. And that's why you may never know until you're sitting in a Starbucks or a Panera having breakfast or coffee, and someone comes up and says, hey, Ron, I've heard something pretty embarrassing about you, and we can make it go away. Here's what we want you to do for us. You see, that is the gift that keeps on giving for generations. It affects me, my family, it affects many of you and your family. So this is why cyber is such an important thing today. It is a very dangerous landscape out there because the offense, the adversary, the bad guys always have the advantage when you're trying to defend in cyber. And I often ask myself, why is cybersecurity so difficult? Because we've been doing this for a long time. In fact, I started in this whole thing almost 30 years ago when I first walked into the National Security Agency, got my first job in cybersecurity. And I'm wondering now, 30 years later, why is this so difficult? Well, the answer is because we are trained and educated, and our whole infrastructure, our whole culture is built on kinetic space, kinetic thinking. Kinetic thinking is different than cyber because kinetic attacks you recognize right off the bat. Many of you still remember, like I do, the attacks on 9/11 when the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, and the Pentagon. And that is etched in our mind as a kinetic attack. We can see it, we can feel it. If you were there, you internalize it. Cyber is very different. It flies below the radar. It's invisible to most people. And we're not really thinking in terms of that. So we talked about the cyber 9/11. I agree with the previous speaker that our cyber 9/11 is not going to be one of these Pearl Harbor-like events. We keep thinking that there's going to be a 9/11 kinetic-like event in cyber. Well, we've already had our cyber 9/11. It happened a long time ago, and it continues to happen every day with the massive number of breaches that the adversary is launching against us and the success that they're having. So cyber is also different today because, you know, very soon, on July the 4th of this year, our country is going to be 242 years old. And we've done a pretty darn good job over the centuries. Our military has defended the country pretty darn well. That's a kinetic defense. You know, it's gone through 2 world wars and other wars, and our military has always been on their A game because they have great leadership, great training, and great technology. That's the world of kinetic space. But the world of cyber is very different today. And one of the things we're going to have to come to grips with, and this is a hard discussion because I'm going to give you some points today that are kind of hard to take. We have to have a clear-eyed view of what we're trying to do, much like we had back in 1961. I was 10 years old, and I still remember, I'm a big fan of NASA, as I said. I remember President Kennedy giving that very famous speech. We were in a hot race with the old Soviet Union, hot missile race. And the president stood up and he gave a very famous speech. He said, we're going to go to the moon and do other things by the end of this decade, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. That was a call to the nation, existential threat, bringing together the best and the brightest of the American people, government, industry, and the academic community. That's an existential threat in the kinetic space. The hard thing to convey today is we have a threat that is just as severe and potentially catastrophic as that threat, but now we're dealing in kinetic space. So our warfighters today, who are using some of the most advanced weapon systems, are in some sense as vulnerable as the rest of us are in those non-traditional systems, because a lot of those computers that they're putting into those weapon systems and all that software and all that firmware and all that complexity is extremely vulnerable. So in some sense, it doesn't make any difference how good and how smart your weapons are. If they fail at the wrong time, then that's game over. And the adversaries know this. That's the hard discussion that we have to have today, because we are still not thinking in kinetic space. I bring up these three reports because these are the Defense Science Board reports that have been produced over the last 5 years. The oldest one in the group was 2013, and I highly recommend that you take a look at these reports. They're not that long, but they will really change your thinking about this issue of kinetic versus cyberspace. The one I always refer to is the very first one, Resilient Military Systems in the Advanced Cyber Threat. When you look at the stack of our systems today, they're very much the same. Applications, middleware, operating systems, firmware, hardware, integrated circuits out to the network. That's a pretty common stack, and when you look at that and the complexity in that stack of hardware, software, and firmware, they describe 3 levels of vulnerabilities in the current way we do our infrastructure and our systems. The first, and you're very familiar with this, known vulnerabilities. Every Tuesday, our big vendors announce the latest patches. And once those patches are announced, you're on the clock to try to get those things fixed before the adversary can exploit the vulnerability, because that's the sequence. Threats exploit vulnerabilities to cause mission business impact, and there's a certain likelihood associated with that. Today, that likelihood is 100%. So the known vulnerabilities are something we can see, we understand those. But the second level down are vulnerabilities called zero-day vulnerabilities, or zero-day attacks. That's where the adversary knows something about your system or your network that you don't know, but you will very soon, because they're going to launch the attack, and then it's going to become a known vulnerability. The third layer down below that is something that happens with the advanced persistent threat. This is nation-state level resources, and in some sense, you don't have to be a nation-state anymore to be a real bad guy or a bad group, because the NSA's hacking tools now have been released, and those are out in the wild, and that empowers even small mom-and-pop terrorist groups or bad guys to do extremely devastating damage to our systems and our networks. So when you look at those 3 levels of vulnerabilities, the ones the adversary creates is that third level. They actually penetrate your system. They establish a presence, sometimes a long time before you discover they're even there. OPM was 7 months. A lot of companies don't even know they're there 2 years after they had the initial intrusion. 2/3 of those vulnerabilities, the 0 days, and the ones the adversary creates, are totally off your radar. And so when you talk about the new strategy today of vulnerability hunting, I hear this every day. We're becoming better vulnerability hunters. We got all kinds of tools and techniques and things we're doing, and we're going to hunt down every one of those vulnerabilities and we're going to get them fixed. That's not happening, because the systems are too complex. And every time you think you've got every one of those, if you give me your 100 vulnerabilities today you discover, your knowns, and you fix them all. I'm going to bring you one tomorrow, a new one tomorrow, and the next day I'll bring you 10 more, and the next day I'll bring you 100 more. Because the complexity of those systems increases your attack surface, and the number of unknown vulnerabilities and those ones the adversary can create are growing at an exponential rate. And that can't be fixed with just cyber hygiene. That's one of the reasons why NIST, during the past 2 years, we've been working on a new series of publications that go beyond our traditional risk management framework, our security controls, our privacy controls, our risk assessment guideline, and we're moving into the world of systems engineering and systems security engineering. And many of you out there are very familiar with the SSE concepts and principles. This is analogous to building better airplanes and bridges. You see, we build bridges and airplanes that are pretty doggone reliable. I fly a lot. I cross bridges in the DC area down here in Alabama. And there's a very high likelihood that I'm going to get to my destination. Why is that? Because we apply best practices in science and engineering and mathematics and everything we know to make sure that design is bulletproof, the materials are solid, and the people putting those bridges and airplanes together are competent to do what they're supposed to do. We do not do the same thing with information technology. And that's pretty obvious just looking around at the number of breaches we continue to have. So the greatest threat to our critical systems today, and our country for that matter, is one word. It's called complexity. And why is that? Because we are literally addicted to the technology. We have a huge blind spot today because the technology is so good and so compelling and we love it to death. We pretty much have that blind spot and ignore some of the vulnerabilities that come with using this great new technology. And it's not an easy argument. It's not an easy issue to deal with because the technology is making us more productive. It's bringing our great companies to new heights on things they never thought they'd be able to do. In fact, my son, I was having a conversation with my son the other day. My son is 36 years old now, so he's not quite a millennial. He's got 1 foot in the millennial bucket and 1 foot in whatever they call that generation after or before the millennials. But I was telling my son Kip, I said, you know, it won't be too long before you're going to buy a brand new car. That car is going to be in your garage. It's going to wake itself up. It's going to contact the dealer. The dealer is going to run remote diagnostics on that car. The car is going to open up the garage door on its own. It's going to drive itself to the dealer. It's going to get serviced. It's going to drive itself back home, close the garage door, and send you the bill in email. That's the world that's not far off. We're already there. I was talking to one of my CIA colleagues the other day, and they were receiving a strange signal inside of Langley. They worry about the electronic signals coming in and out of that place, as you might imagine. They were getting a strange signal that they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And so they organized their cyber SWAT team, and they're going room to room, and they finally isolated the signal coming from the cafeteria. And they went back in the back of the cafeteria, and they pinpointed the signal coming from a new dishwasher they just took delivery on last week. The dishwasher was being wirelessly updated, the software, from remote where that vendor was 1,000 miles away. From their perspective, that's not a good thing. But that's the world that we're building. It's very capable, it's very complex, and we have to find ways to reduce and manage this complexity. That's what engineering brings to this problem space. Least functionality, least privilege. Many of you cybersecurity folks know those are the two of our fundamental concepts. And if we would just follow those two things, we would cut down many, many, many cyber attacks and damage that we have to endure today. So this is the big question that everybody is going to face as we try to deal with our senior executives and the CEOs and the heads of federal agencies who are totally focused on mission space. We have to be able to make the credible argument that this technology is great, we're glad it's supporting the mission of the business, but unless and until we're able to protect it, your mission and your business is in great jeopardy. And we've seen that played out over and over and over again in so many different areas. This is my slide. By the way, I do all my own slides, and I learned how to animate my slides during the government shutdown 3 years ago. Because we're not allowed to work or do anything. You just have to kind of lock yourself down and sit in your room, and for me, that's almost impossible. So I figured I'm going to take this chance to learn how to animate slides, so I did that, and now I get carried away sometimes, but that's my animation. Data is everywhere. You know, one of the problems with the breaches, not just at OPM, but Equifax, every one of these breaches have huge databases. And the reason why we have so much data in many cases is because we can just store it now. When I started out in this business decades ago, storage was a minimal thing. You had to really be careful on how you program, and your secondary storage was just minimal. Today, we're gigabytes and terabytes and petabytes, and the secondary, flash drives now that can carry an enormous amount of information. So since we can collect it, we just pile it up, and it gets higher and higher and higher. Now in the OPM case, we lost about 22.5 million records of personally identifiable information, some of the most sensitive data you could ever hope to imagine. So the lesson that we learned there, too late, was that you don't have to have all of your corporate data accessible to everybody out there on the network. Well, the other lesson we learned was, hey, how about using two-factor authentication to get into the most critical database on the planet, or one of the most critical? That's another lesson we learned. But take those big databases, and the amount of data that you have to use on a day-to-day basis is very much not 22.5 million records. If you're doing security clearances, you're either doing 5-year re-ups on those clearances, or you're getting somebody ready to get a new clearance. That's a very tiny portion of all the people in that database. So move the vast majority of your critical data to a safe zone. I call that the safe deposit box model. I have a lot of important stuff in my house, but I managed to find out those really critical things and move them to a safer domain, more secure. That's the safe deposit box. It's a real pain to get the stuff out, but it's also, more protection than I would have against a typical criminal who might break into my house, which has locks on the doors and all the usual precautions. This is really a central issue today. We are going to have two separate discussions about our cyber protection, and it's all focused on criticality of data and criticality of assets. We're going to have to raise the bar very much higher on those critical assets and let the rest of the stuff go. And right now, we have pretty much a unified approach. And that means we're working way too hard in some areas and not nearly hard enough in other areas to make sure that we're well protected. So, again, I'm a huge NASA fan, and I've witnessed over the years, I was talking to Jonathan, one of my most favorite trips outside of coming to Alabama was going down to NASA, the Johnson Space Center. I went down there in 2010, and I just happened to arrive at this was the second to the last shuttle mission. And the mission was to put the last antenna on the International Space Station. They took me into the control center, which for me was like one of my lifelong dreams. And they downloaded a picture in real time from the shuttle taking a picture of the space station, download that picture, and I still have that on my wall. So, we've had so many space launches over the years, successful launches. We've had a few failures, but very few, because NASA understands how to operate in complex environments and hostile environments, and they do it pretty doggone well. NASCAR also understands that problem. Those of you NASCAR fans, there's probably only a handful out here maybe, but remember Dale Earnhardt lost his life at Daytona. That was, I think, in 2001 probably, a long time ago. And NASCAR operates in a hostile environment. That's part of their business model. They're driving those high-performance race cars around that track at 200 miles an hour, 2 inches from a cement barrier. Well, when Dale Earnhardt was killed, they didn't fold their tent. They said, let's get our engineers in on this problem and see how we can fix this. And they invented a device called the Hans device, head and neck safety. Every driver wears it. And there have been a lot of horrific crashes since 2001. Not one driver has ever been killed because the neck was broken during a crash. That is good engineering, operating in hostile space. You've seen it in automobile, the industry. My first car barely had a seatbelt. And then I remember airbags became optional. When I graduated from the military academy, my first new car, I had a choice of an airbag or an 8-track stereo player. Now, some of you folks who are younger out there, 8-tracks are what we used to use to listen to music back in the day. My rental car now is so advanced with that screen, I can't even figure out how to play anything anymore, so I long for those old days. But the point is, I chose the 8-track because second lieutenants didn't need airbags. We were bulletproof, so we didn't need those airbags. But the point is, over the years, the automobile industry, there was some government regulation, and there was some just good engineering on the part of the industry to bring safer automobiles to customers. Airbags, seatbelts, steel reinforced doors, the engine compartment that collapses now. And now you have all the cyber features which prevent you from changing lanes and hitting the car next to you. You see, all of this innovation is built in because the automobile industry wants to give their customers safer cars. So I'm asking, challenging industry, where is that same motivation on the part of our great industry that produces some of the greatest technologies that we could ever hope for? Now, I guarantee the car manufacturers don't give me the option of installing my own airbag. You know, they don't come into the dealer and say, okay, you want an airbag, pick it up at the parts department and you can install it yourself. No, that stuff is built in. Because just like people who use computers, we shouldn't ask our customers, our consumers, our users of this technology to have to do things that are buried deep in the hardware, the software, and the firmware. That is where the foundation of protection comes from. And that's why we're moving this discussion into an engineering focus and not relying just on the traditional cyber hygiene. What makes this problem interesting for me is the fact that we've seen a real convergence in so many areas. When I first came to NSA in 1990, there was a really bright line between national security and national security systems and the things that were non-national security and those systems. But over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades, that line is pretty much gone. We still have classified information and national security systems, but the technology that the intelligence community and our warfighters use is the same technology, for the most part, that you all are using in those non-national security systems. So the vulnerabilities that occur in power plants or in the financial systems are the same ones that may occur in the Pentagon. And this convergence now has brought this issue to a national security level of concern. This is getting into the very difficult discussion I started out with. It's called asymmetric warfare. And this goes back to my point. We know how to defend ourselves pretty darn well in kinetic space, but we haven't figured out yet how to defend ourselves in cyberspace, and that is where the adversary is going to bring us down. The director of NSA said a few years ago that we are losing almost $1 trillion a year in intellectual property. Now that could be anything from the next generation automobile designs at General Motors or Ford. How about the design documentation for the F-35? That was stolen. And how would you like to be an Air Force pilot, knowing that those design documentations are in the hands of the adversary? What are they going to do with it? 2 things. They're going to start building countermeasures for that aircraft, or they're going to build their own version, maybe less expensive. But that is what happens when the adversary attacks. And this is why, again, getting back to the cyber discussion and the kinetic discussion, people think of cyber as, hey, I have to lose my capability before I'm concerned. That's only one bad thing that can happen of 2 bad things. Losing the capability in the air traffic control system would be catastrophic. That's a capability loss. But exfiltration happens even when your system appears to be working just fine. That's the cyber problem. It's kind of like having cancer in the early stages. One cancer cell can multiply, they double at a certain rate. And as those cancer cells double, eventually they're going to attack the body's critical organs, they're going to kill you. That's the slow bleed that's going on right now as we speak at this conference. These attacks are occurring often with great devastation, And we pretty much have a lot of data now on all of the things that are going on. We know who the adversaries are. We know what attacks have occurred. We can predict which attacks are likely to occur. And we pretty much know who the big targets are. We know all that. The question is, how are we going to defend ourselves in the 21st century? This is what we're going to talk about in the last 20 minutes or so. How do you defend yourself in cyberspace in 2018 and beyond? In 2017, when the new administration took over, there's been a real push to modernize the federal IT infrastructure. And I kind of characterized the whole movement, and this really applies to everything we're doing. If we could do these three simple things, we would be 90% of the way ahead in protecting our critical assets and systems from cyber attacks. Simplify, innovate, and automate. Three simple words, but very, very hard to do. Simplification of the critical infrastructure means using the best practices in systems engineering and security engineering to reduce the attack surface. And what is attack surface today? It's everything you touch. You cannot exist in today's society without interacting some way with the internet and all the technology. And that is all part of attack surface. So when you look at an operating system that has 65 million lines of code, all of this complexity with middleware and the firmware and all of the stuff, that complexity gives the adversary a huge tactical advantage because they have a lot of places that they can probe and exploit. And so simplifying the infrastructure goes back to just one good old-fashioned concept of enterprise architecture. Consolidate, optimize, standardize. It's kind of a version of least functionality, least privilege. And this goes to the discussion of whitelisting. Why is it so hard to whitelist? Because people love applications. We're addicted to the technology. In fact, it's so bad, and this is an example. I like to use analogies. I was at a movie with my wife. It was almost a year or two ago, and we were sitting in the movie waiting for it to start, and I had just been issued a brand new government smartphone. And so I asked when I got the smartphone, I said, what can we put on this phone? And our CISO said, only mission essential applications can go on that phone. So I said, okay, that makes sense to me. So I'm sitting in the movie, and the announcer comes on and says, you can download an application for your phone right now that will tell you the optimal time to go to the restroom in the movie you're about to see. So now I'm thinking, mission essential not. So I'm 67 years old. Now for a young person out there, definitely I don't download that. For me, that's a mission essential application. So this is the dilemma, to whitelist or not to whitelist. Whitelisting is hard because you have to tell people no, don't run all those crazy applications, because just think about your smartphone, whether it's an Apple or iPhone or Samsung, Android, whatever it might be. It's all the same problem. Or tablets, you have lots of apps on there. What's the first thing that happens when you download a new app? They make you punch this little thing that says yes to everything. I give access to everything. Now, most of us don't have a clue what's going on that smartphone. We don't know where those applications have been written, what's in them, what they're doing. In fact, I heard a funny story the other day about one of the apps for the smartphone is the flashlight app. And if you go out there and someone took the time to look at how large these flashlight apps are. One of them, I think, was 92 megabytes for a flashlight app. Now, I don't know, you computer science folks out there and programmers, I guarantee you it doesn't take 92 megabytes to turn a flashlight on and off on a smartphone. So what's going on with all that code? It's one of the primary vectors of malicious code. So we have to be a lot more discerning as customers because we are part of the problem. We have that big blind spot. And we have to be able to separate our discussion. That's why simplification is critical. Consolidate, optimize, standardize. Leaner, meaner IT. Reduce the attack surface. Don't give the adversary so much of an advantage. Innovation has always got us out of tough spots. There's some great new technology now with virtualization techniques. I'll talk about those in a few minutes that can really help you churn the infrastructure faster than the adversary can do damage. Because they have to have time on target. They got to get in, they have to understand the environment, and then they have to exploit. If you can reduce that time, that's a really good thing. And of course, automation goes without saying. So the federal government, what are we doing about this at the federal level? We have a three-pronged strategy trying to move a lot of our systems to shared services. Why? Because we have 24 major federal agencies. If every federal agency builds their own email system or their own payroll system, you've got 4 major investment costs with that system. The initial cost of building the system, then you have the maintenance tail on that system, which is usually larger than the cost of the actual system development. You have the initial cybersecurity protections and safeguards, and you have continuous monitoring. It's a huge cost. Why do 24 when you can do 1? You'll save the taxpayers a huge amount of money, you'll consolidate into a single service, and then you can spend more to harden that particular target of opportunity. So we need to do a whole lot more of that. FedRAMP, cloud computing. Cloud computing is phenomenal for helping you be more productive. You don't have to own everything now. You can provision the capability as you need it, whether it's software as a service, infrastructure, or platform as a service. We have FedRAMP approved cloud providers now that have been verified. All those controls that are in the NIST catalog, those things have been implemented by the cloud providers, and they've gone through the FedRAMP process. That gives you some level of assurance those controls are in place and working. Now, you may not want to move all your stuff to the cloud because the third category here is isolate and protect your high-value assets. We started to do that after the OPM breach. My friend Martin Stanley from DHS, he's running the high-value asset project, going around to every federal agency, identifying the high-value assets. Sometimes it surprises you those high-value assets may not be your high-impact systems under FIPS 199, because the adversary may view that system as high value, and maybe you don't. They may be able to get into one of your lower impact systems and then use that as a transitive attack to get to the target of opportunity. That's the danger of making sure that all of your connections are absolutely essential. We found a lot of high value assets today that are connected to way too many other systems. There's just too many connections that are unnecessary. Again, least functionality, least privilege. Reduce the number of ports, protocols, services, connections to the very mission essential minimum. And then only give privileges to those folks who need to have that kind of ability to do systems administration or whatever it might be. So, here's a new strategy. We traditionally have a one-dimensional way of looking at our cyber security protections. This is called penetration resistance. Harden the target. You try to build that castle wall and those protections so they're bulletproof. But we know even if you do everything right and reduce all of your known vulnerabilities, the adversary, and we have empirical data to back this up, will pretty much be able to get in, especially high-end nation-state assets that are throwing their best and their brightest at you. Maybe 5 to 10% of your systems will be vulnerable even after you do everything you can do in the cyber hygiene arena or two-factor encryption, the things that you traditionally see in the NIST catalog, in the baseline controls. That doesn't work. So what do you do when it fails, when the adversary is already inside? Well, now we have to go to better architecture and engineering. This is what I talked about earlier. You've got to make sure just because they get in, they can't burn the whole house down. There are architectural and engineering techniques we can use to do two things. We can limit the time on target by using massive virtualization techniques, virtual machines, micro-virtualization, because those VMs are churning at a rate that doesn't allow the malicious code to actually do a whole lot of damage. The other thing we can do is limit their lateral movement, horizontal movement. It shouldn't be the case that one contractor sitting in Hawaii gets into an NSA system and is able to do as much damage as Snowden was able to do. That's an architectural failure. Compartmentalization, segmentation, domain separation, those are fundamentals in the 21st century that we have to make sure that we adhere to. Make it difficult. If they got in to the system, make it extremely difficult for them to move from one domain to the next, which means putting your critical assets in that safe deposit place where it's harder for them to get access. Finally, we want to make these systems resilient. What does that mean? I call this limping over the goal line. You've got to be able to design systems today through good engineering, good architecture, best practices of security design that we've known for at least 40 years. We have to be able to design systems that can withstand the attack and still support critical missions and business operations tomorrow on an ongoing basis. So, cyber resiliency. We have a brand new publication. We started in 2016 with our engineering series. The number is SP Special Pub 800-160. Many of you may not be familiar with it. We took best practices in cybersecurity and we integrated them into an ISO IEEE systems engineering standard. It's the playbook for how to build security into systems from a system engineering perspective. In other words, we didn't start with the security engineers. We went to the system engineer's house. We said, look, you guys know how to build stuff. You've been doing it a long time. Here are some things across all of your 30 processes that you use to build a system. Here's where you can consider the necessary and essential security capabilities and things, best practice to integrate in each stage of that system's life cycle. It's a very powerful document. And just this month, we released volume 2 of the series. It's called a Cyber Resiliency Guideline. It capitalizes on that engineering guidance in 800-160, volume 1, and it talks about how do you do cyber resiliency when you're building a new system. That's one aspect. But what do you do with the 90% of your systems that are already here, installed base? What can you do? And we give you a whole bunch of information on how to make your current systems more cyber resilient. So you can see there's a very common overlap with lots of other disciplines that we've known about for a long time. And for some reason, we just have not brought security into the same discussion as our classic things. Safety, for example. We have a high degree of overlap in safety systems and things we do to make safer things. And we have reliability and fault tolerance. All of these disciplines now are part of a life cycle development when we're building critical systems. I'm talking about power plants, weapon systems, things, medical devices. Those medical devices, the pacemakers that go into people's chests and have wireless access. You really want to know who your friends are in that case because they can do great damage to you now just by sitting a few feet from you with wireless access in that environment. So these are some of the things that we brought forward in the Cyber Resiliency Guideline. There's constructs. This is based on science and engineering and best practices. There are objectives and techniques and approaches talking about specific technologies that you can use. And I'm going to go through, these are all laid out in great detail in our publication, but this is where everything comes together at the top of that risk management strategy, and it drives the cyber resiliency objectives, and then that drives the techniques and the specific approaches that you can use to make sure those techniques can be satisfied. And all of this is brought together in the context of design principles, both structural and strategic. So you get the stakeholders involved early in the life cycle, senior leaders. They have to own this problem. They can't just push it off on the CISO anymore, or the CIO, or someone downstream. They have to own the problem. These are just a few of the techniques that we use today to make our installed base of legacy systems more resilient. You may recognize a few of these. Segmentation, pretty common. Redundancy, diversity, non-persistence. And we explain each one of these resiliency techniques and show you how you can implement either one or a multitude of these, depending on what your needs are. It's a very flexible cyber resiliency framework that can be tailored for every type of mission, business operation, or the environment that you might operate in. Again, I talked about the 800-160. These are the 14 technical processes that are part of the IEEE ISO systems engineering standard. And I just put these up to show you how important it is to start having cyber security and privacy discussions early in the life cycle. You can see the first 3 processes: mission business analysis, stakeholder needs and requirements. This is where you're sitting around the table as a cybersecurity professional or privacy professional, and you are listening to the CEO or the head of the agency describe, or that one level down, what's the next mission that we are going to attack, or business opportunity? And what kind of technologies are we going to be using to make sure that we can deliver that mission or that business opportunity to our customers? And that's where you start to have this discussion about what is it going to take to have protection, what are your protection needs today, based on the fact that technology is the lifeblood of your mission or business, and it has to be dependable. You see, having that discussion is critical because out of those discussions with the senior leaders, protection needs come security requirements and privacy requirements. And those are driven into that third process called system requirements. A subset of all system requirements, whether it's a weapon system, it has to have certain capability to put steel on target. You also now have to make sure that you integrate privacy requirements and security requirements into that discussion. And you're going to go through a trade space war. You know, the war fighters want everything. They want that system to do everything. Well, you get into the reality of cost, schedule, and performance. And there's something called a trade space discussion. You're arguing over different requirements. How much is this going to cost? You know, can we do it in time? That same discussion has to take place with security because it has to be built in early and throughout the life cycle. And all of those things from architecture to design, implementation, verification, validation, all the way through to when you retire that system, security and privacy are integrated, hardwired into that. So I want to talk a little bit about our newest update. Many of you are familiar with the classic risk management framework. It's been around for almost a decade in various forms. The last major update, I think, was 2010. We've been updating a little bit. But based on the President's modernization initiative, we are completely retooling all of our FISMA publications. This is one of the most important ones. This is not the cybersecurity framework. This is the risk management framework that our federal agencies and our contractors have been using for many, many years. And you can notice there's a brand new step there at the heart of this 6-step RMF. It's now got a 7th step. It's called organizational preparation. This is a critical step because this now takes a lot of our guidance in the enterprise-wide risk management guideline 839 and integrates it into the system-level RMF process. Why is that important? Because this makes sure that your senior leaders are engaged in the cybersecurity discussions early in the life cycle. Things like having a risk management strategy, having a risk tolerance defined, identifying all the common controls, things that the system owners should not have to worry about. All of this preparation work is going to make life for the system owners a whole lot easier to do on a day-to-day basis. Now, we've done a lot of work on the RMF, and this document now, and it's out there for public review right now. You can go download it. 837 Revision 2. We're accepting comments until June 22nd. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting. The first thing it's doing is going to put that new preparation step in, so it's got a lot of new security features in that framework, which I think you're going to like a lot, and make your job not only easier, but be more effective in building security programs. The next thing we did, this is the first framework anywhere in the world now that will serve 2 different communities. It's going to serve the security professionals, but it's also going to serve the privacy professionals too. You know, our control catalog, 853, has security controls and privacy controls since 2013. But we never really had a framework for our privacy officers to help select their controls. So we renovated and updated the RMF. Now you can do both security control selection and management as well as privacy controls. That's a huge deal, especially with things happening in Europe with GDPR and some of those things. Privacy is becoming a frontline issue today. And we are building all this capability into our framework so you can do both in the same organization. We also have a special publication for supply chain. You know, we depend on our supply chain for a whole lot of stuff today. We used to make everything here, not so much anymore. So supply chain risk is really, really critical. As we import all these components from who knows where, we have to do a much better job at managing supply chain security risks. And we built that into the RMF as well. There's actually a new task within our task list that encourages you to have a supply chain risk management plan as part of your critical documents when you get that system authorized. And by the way, system authorizations now, or security authorizations, the ATO process is not just for security anymore. When a senior leader does an ATO, they're doing it for security, privacy, and supply chain risk all at the same time. One senior leader taking feeds from all the different critical staff elements, one team, one mission, integrating all of these things into one area. So the other things that go along with this, I mentioned that preparation step, better communication between the C-suite and the implementers, the operators. No different than the military. The commander has a vision, the commander's vision for the battle. That commander's vision is conveyed all the way from the Army to the Corps to the divisions, the brigades, battalions, the companies, down to the individual squads. That commander's vision goes up and down the chain. Communication is critical in the military. It's also critical in our cyber security operations today. That's what the RMF preparation step is going to help materialize that, all of those types of ideas. We also took the opportunity to align the RMF, the risk management framework, with the cybersecurity framework. That framework has the taxonomy of the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, the life cycle process for cyber. We've taken that whole framework apart with its categories and subcategories, and we've overlaid it onto the RMF. So now, if you want to do the cybersecurity framework and you have to do the RMF, you can use the RMF to do both. It's really a more efficient way of doing business. And last but not least, this is what I mentioned earlier, we've aligned our engineering processes in 801.60 with the risk management framework. So if you're doing the RMF and you're working in the engineering community as part of the same organization, you can now see where the engineering activities kind of align with the risk management framework. You know, engineers, they hate getting a bunch of security controls shoved down their throat by the CIO. I know this to be true because I work with my colleagues in the DoD, and there are two very different worlds over there. There's the folks in the AT&L and the people who are designing and building systems, weapon systems, command and control, and there's the folks in the CIO office. They're pushing out controls, and you know, you get a program manager just getting ready to release a new weapon system, and they dump 900 controls on them. They say, what's this? You see, we are bringing these worlds together because that program manager shouldn't have to deal with 900 controls when you're getting ready to launch that system. The requirements for security should drive the controls that are selected by that program manager early in the life cycle and give them an opportunity to build this stuff in early and throughout the life cycle. That's the message there. So we're bringing all these things together, and that is our hope for RMF 2.0. At the end of the day, we need a whole lot more of transparency and traceability, because my opening argument here is that our systems that we're building are so complex that we don't really understand what we're building and what we're deploying. So how in the world can you trust anything in a critical system when you don't understand what you've deployed? That's going to be the discussion that we're going to have clear-eyed, just like I mentioned in the president's speech back in 1961. Looking at the Soviet Union, understanding the threat, we built our nuclear triad during that time, the bombers, the missiles, and the submarines. That was part of our national strategy called mutual assured destruction. That worked really well in the kinetic world that we lived in and still keeps us safe today. But what is the equivalent strategy today for keeping us safe as a country in the world of cyber, where cyber is coming right into that kinetic world? Massive convergence of cyber and physical systems. You cannot pull them apart any longer. How do we develop that same trust that we had with those very critical systems back 2 or 3 decades ago? That's a big, big issue. Here are some things coming down the pike from NIST. The RMF 2.0 will be published in final after we go through 2 rounds of public comments, October of 2018. Our big update for SP 853 Rev 5, That is an awesome document as well. We're working very closely with the Privacy Office of the White House, OIRA, and that will have a fully integrated catalog of security and privacy controls. There's no more appendix with just privacy controls. Those privacy controls are fully integrated into a consolidated and unified control catalog. And we keep adding controls every day based upon new threats and new vulnerabilities that we see within our infrastructure and within our critical federal environment, our systems. And then, of course, we have our assessment guideline being updated right in tandem with the 53. That'll give you all the assessment procedures. How do you assess all those security controls, the privacy controls, to make sure they're effective? On the engineering side, I mentioned the Cyber Resiliency Guideline. That's volume 2, out for public comment. We just closed the public comment period a few days ago, and that document will be finalized in October of 2018. And then we have 2 other similar publications addressing the engineering aspects for software assurance and hardware assurance. See, we're going deep into the system now. We're not just working above the waterline anymore, which is where most of our customers were. We are going down under the waterline. We're getting into the engine compartment. We're trying to understand how these systems actually work. Where are vulnerabilities deep in those systems, buried in operating systems and firmware? And how vulnerable are we in things we're actually pushing out today in these critical systems? So that's kind of where we are. And I'm going to just give you a couple of closing thoughts. We're already working pretty darn hard. We have lots of people working on this problem. I know you have many people in your organization. You can never hire enough people. We're going at this thing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we need to work smarter, not harder. And so that's what we're trying to do with RMF 2.0, the new security control catalog, all the engineering guidelines. We have to be able to take the tactical advantage away from the adversary. We have to rip it away from them. We have to make it absolutely miserable for them to get in, once they're in, to do anything destructive, and then as the last speaker mentioned, make it really, really not worth their while to do that in the first place. These are the 2 things you want to achieve. Our ultimate objective is build it into the infrastructure. You shouldn't have to have a separate security office or a privacy office, because those individuals should be part of your critical, your normal things that you do as an organization, whether it's acquisition or engineering or enterprise architecture. All of those teams that are building systems and doing the procurements, they should be infused with security and privacy professionals so they can work side by side, one team, one mission, to make sure this stuff actually gets done. Somebody asked me once at a conference, what are the 3 most important things to build a good cybersecurity program? And I said these 3 things. And they really thought they didn't really understand why that could be, because they don't look like they're really security-related things. But leadership, governance, and accountability. If you don't have a strong dose of all 3 of those, then nothing else matters. Strong leaders to understand the threat, how the technology is being used, understand what the modern cyber attacks can do, not just in general, but to your organization. What can they do to our mission, our business opportunities, our things that we're trying to do as an organization? And taking appropriate action. That takes a lot of guts today, because a lot of people are blinded by that blind spot. And the technology is so good and compelling. It takes tough leadership. And that whitelisting example I gave you is just one indicator of how difficult it can be. Governance and accountability. You have to own this problem. The days of passing it off, that's why we have that organizational prep step. So the senior leadership, they are part of the team. If the ship is going to sink, it's their responsibility, not the CISO or the CIO or those security professionals or people out on the point who are literally sweating and working day and night to protect these critical systems. We have to give them top cover so they can do their jobs, and that means finding a different way to do business than business as usual. This is where we started the discussion. I mentioned President Kennedy and that famous speech. Existential threat today, it's in the cyberspace, it's not in the kinetic space. The sooner we understand this as a country, all the way from the president through the executive agencies, out to our Fortune 500 companies, small mom and pop. As soon as we come to grips of the cyber aspects versus kinetic, then we can start to embark upon a course which can use good architecture and engineering. The things that we use to build bridges and airplanes, we can do that in the world of IT and cyber. And then, only then, are we going to get back to these three very important words. I started out the discussion about freedom. Why do we talk about freedom? Because if you can't defend yourself in cyberspace in the 21st century, security and privacy, if you can't do those two things, then freedom is not going to be something that will be very far behind. You'll be losing that very quickly because the adversary is eroding our capabilities and our intellectual property every day, day by day. Every cyber attack continues to happen. So this is a pretty big problem that we're facing. We know it's on the radar. The real question is, what are we going to do about that? And that's why conferences like the NCS, and by the way, you've done a terrific job over the years in building this conference. The attendees here this year, the fact that we have some graybeards like myself, we have a whole lot of young people, which are the future, by the way. I'd like to echo the previous speaker. We need every one of you. Whether you come into federal service or use your cybersecurity or privacy skills in our great private sector, we need everybody, all hands on deck, and we got to bring our A game because freedom is the most important thing that we have. And without that, we don't have anything. So with that, here's my contact information. I hesitate to put this on the screen sometime, but that's my cell phone. And I tell people, every one of you out there, whether you're in the federal government or whether you're in the private sector, you're still customers of ours because as taxpayers, you pay my salary. So you're our customers. And I make this offer to every one of you. I put my cell phone out there. You can hit me on Twitter and LinkedIn and all those things. Send me email. But if you've got a problem, any day of the night or any day of the week, 24/7, you can call me on my cell phone. And if I'm available, I will answer that call. And that's how passionate I am about this problem, because that last slide says it all. If we can't protect ourselves and protect our freedom, then nothing else matters. So please take advantage of that. Thank you for your patience today. I may take a few questions if we have time. If not, I will be around and you guys can hit me offline there. Thank you guys very much for patience. I think we have time for a couple of questions. You let the last speaker off pretty easily. I wonder if I'll get off as easily.
So no, Ron, you won't. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm right back here in the middle. Fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. I loved your emphasis on the risk equation of its being a function of threat, vulnerability, impact, and probability. During your presentation, you talked about, hey, the really good threats, at least what I heard, they're going to find a way in. And we can't fix all vulnerabilities. So why isn't step one going toward that engineering impact, engineering out consequences to us which are unacceptable?
I wish I could take you with me at every conference that I attend, because that should be the number one thing we do. This is the classic debate we're having now. With the RMF and all that world that we've grown up with, it's always been, it started a lot about compliance and bringing controls to the problem, but the engineering guidelines that we have out now start exactly with that. We look at the threat and we look at the actual real world technology. Every system, and we define this in our chapter 2 of 800-160, has a system boundary and a set of elements within that boundary. Elements could be operating systems, network devices, applications, people, processes, and we understand the trustworthiness of every one of those components. You see, you can't always get that trusted operating system, but you can make some good decisions about what you're bringing into that system boundary before that system ever goes live. Or if you have installed base, you can go back after the fact and look at what you've got and look for those single points of failure. So absolutely, that should be the number one step. And I would even go so far as to say, with critical assets, you can forget the likelihood part of that component.
Yep.
When the United States built our nuclear triad, I mentioned that earlier, they didn't do a risk assessment. That was the most expensive investment this country ever made. Bombers, missiles, and submarines. We didn't do risk assessment. The only thing we had to know is that the Soviet Union had the capability to launch a first strike. And we had to build the capability to launch the second strike. We know we were vulnerable. The impact in this case to us was losing our country, our freedom. So the funny thing about that is the likelihood of us ever using that nuclear capability was less than 0.00001. But we still built the capability because it's not what the adversary is likely to do to you, it's what can they do to you. I'm talking about critical assets now. You have to make the assumption, 100% likelihood, you either have been attacked or you're going to get attacked. And if those are critical assets, you go right to what you just said about that engineering approach. Thank you for the question.
Awesome, Ron. Thank you. I am a nuclear submariner. I will be speaking about cyber resiliency at 1:30 next door. I would be honored if you could join me.
Well, thank you. That was a great shameless plug on his part, too. That's a great thing. There you go. We always like those plugs. Anybody else have any questions? I want to make sure we are respectful of the time this morning.
Yes, I have a question. I'm Stephen Miller with Eastern New Mexico University. We're a Center of Academic Excellence, and we focus in risk assessment. And I was wondering if you're going to be implementing the CSET tool for the RMF, can we use that as we have with the critical infrastructure framework?
Yes, I believe all of the tools that have been built around things like the risk management framework in our security control catalog. DHS has many of those. A lot of the private sector vendors out there that many of you use to manage your GRC type of activities. Those I hope will be updated to reflect the new things in the RMF. Step 0, the RMF prep step as we call it, I would expect all the tool makers eventually will be integrating those new capabilities that are coming from RMF 2.0 into all of those tools and techniques. So you'll be able to use those downstream to do the same things you're doing now, but have greater capability.
Great. And by the way, I'm a NASA fan too. I was on the Apollo projects, Apollo 12 through 17. So I'm glad you're a NASA fan.
Well, yeah, my favorite movie, many of you saw Apollo 13. My favorite scene from that movie was when, on the ground, they come into the small room with these engineers, and they dump a box full of stuff on the table and say, you got to fix something up here that these astronauts can build out there in space that's going to save their lives. See, if we can do that, we can do this. That's my point. We have to bring back that same spirit. We put the man on the moon on July the 20th, 1969. I remember that day very, very vividly because I'd only been at West Point for 20 days, and they woke all 4,400 cadets up at 2 in the morning. They marched us all to a big auditorium. We watched that first moon landing. Now, think about that. That's 1950s and 1960s technology, and we did that. Every day when I walk outside, I see a moon, full moon. I say, we had people up there. You know, how awesome is that? We can do that. We can do all this stuff that we're talking about today. Thank you guys very much. Oh, okay. I'm not going to...
Thank you, Ron, and thank you for being here. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your thought leadership on this in this field of cybersecurity. I was thinking as he was speaking that we need to make sure the Department of Homeland Security includes Dr. Ross on that list of highly valued national assets based on the work that he's done through his career. So, yes. On behalf of, I have 2 coins for you. On behalf of Cyber Huntsville, I want to present you for being here a Cyber Huntsville coin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And also have, on behalf of ISSA and Cyber Huntsville, a 10-year National Cyber Summit commemorative coin. It'll get you into any NASCAR venue in the country.
There you go. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks a lot.